Well, you have made it to the last week of the course, and I hope that you have the sense coming here to the finish line that you've completed a rich study of the text of the Gospel of Matthew and allowed it to generate all kinds of pressing theological matters, especially as they pertain to our calling as communities of Jesus' disciples. The last little stretch of the narrative that we have in this short week just between now and Friday is, of course, the telling of the empty tomb, the appearance of Jesus to the first witnesses, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, his speaking to them, the plot to cover up what has happened by the Jerusalem authorities, and then finally a closing appearance of Jesus on a mountain that he had designated for his disciples, specifically the remaining 11, since Judas has taken his own life in the preceding part of the story, and comes to these 11 disciples. Jesus does. They see him. You can imagine all that they have been through in recent days. We don't learn of any appearances in Jerusalem in Matthew, so this is the first time, at least in the drama of Matthew, that they're seeing Jesus, and they worship him and they doubt him at the same time. And Jesus responds to this ambivalence with words of assurance about the power that he has received by virtue of the life that he has lived and the death that he has died, and now how he has been raised from among the dead. Power in heaven and on earth, all power. And this power that was promised to the heir of the human, the Son of Man, in Daniel 7, has now been received by Jesus and is shared, as Jesus has so often shared his power up until now. This is the nature of his power. It's a sharing power. He shares it with these 11, telling them to disciple all the peoples of the world by baptizing them and teaching them. Baptizing them in the triune name, the significance of each name coming from the way that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit have acted in Matthew, and teaching these peoples all that Jesus has commanded the disciples, especially in the 5 discourses of Matthew. And this is the way that Jesus' worldwide power as judge, as deliverer, will be felt, through the discipling of the peoples by these apostles. And we're, of course, studying this book because we have been touched by that extension of Jesus' power through them, and especially through the story that they told, including the story of Matthew. The resurrection, as you will gather from the podcast exposition, is perhaps somewhat peculiar compared to what we're accustomed to saying about it. Peculiar as it's presented in Matthew. It's not the kind of unequivocal triumph, perhaps, that we might have some appetite for still at this stage in the narrative. It's not a lengthy sort of denouement, resolution of everything in the story with the clear and satisfying exaltation of Jesus. In some ways, it's rather fleeting. We don't see that much of Jesus. Jesus says relatively little, and yet it is powerful in the way that Jesus' few words, even his silence, his troubling presence, have been throughout Matthew. And so I hope you'll consider in some ways, the peculiar way that Jesus is revealed to his disciples and to us as raised from among the dead, as the firstborn of all of the human and the rest of creation, and then with the disciples with a powerful presence, God with us here at the very end of the story, through the end of the age that's approaching and beyond. I'll be anxious to hear your reactions to how the threads of the story come together, especially in that closing scene in Galilee. There's just one response forum that invites you to give a brief reaction to the material for the week, any material that you want. I do urge you to read the article by Weaver on women in the Gospel of Matthew. I think it's a really stimulating piece and worth some conversation among us, even if it's brief here in the last week. Of course, I think your main assignment for the week is your final reflection paper, and I want to say a few words about that here in this intro video for week 11. It is a reflection paper rather than the interpretive kind of paper that we have done up until now, and by that I mean that there's no expectation that you're delivering a kind of careful, rigorous interpretation of any one passage. Of course, it is a paper that should reflect on how you have interpreted Matthew this term, even if it doesn't get into any detailed textual analysis, although it can do some of that if you want. Basically, what I'm trying to give you an open-ended opportunity to do is to take a step back and look at the panorama of this epic story we've been studying this term, and to see the dramatic development now having been formed by careful attention to each segment of the narrative, and to think very broadly about the theme of conflict. I want you to think about how conflict works in the Gospel of Matthew, and then I want you to identify a particular conflict in your life. It could be on a very macro sort of scale, geopolitical in scope. It could be something much more personal, something much more kind of small scale in your life, but nevertheless a case of conflict. And then to take that conflict as you introduce it and subject it to the sort of dramatic development of the Gospel of Matthew, and to allow conflict as presented by Matthew to affect how you describe and understand the case of conflict that you'd like to reflect on. And so to kind of allow yourself to situate that conflict and how to understand it, perhaps even how to engage it according to the Gospel of Matthew, its teaching on conflict. It is a kind of theological work with the narrative, you might say, with, I hope, a pastoral sensibility. But as you've often, I think, observed in our class, the way that we do theological, pastoral reflection with gospel stories is often flying only at 30,000 feet above the text of the narrative and never really getting into the details or the subtle developments of it. And now I hope you're equipped to do something better than that. Reflection that is actually nourished and deeply informed by the intricacies of the story that you have worked with this term, that have hopefully given you a lot of sophistication when it comes to the way you describe and engage a particular case of conflict. So there's an assignment guide. As always, there are samples for you to consider, and I look forward to reading your reflections here as the course draws to a close. I hope you do come away, as I said at the beginning, with a sense of deep and searching learning from the Gospel of Matthew, and perhaps the sense that this story about conflict as well as about other matters is very rich. It should enable you to be much more careful with how you speak about the matters of our life, and might even make it hard for you to speak fluently about some of those matters, because the story has engendered certain difficulties in our way of imagining how things work, how God is present, how God is revealed. But ultimately, I hope the ability to be able to speak with nuance and truth, and consequently to be able to see with more insight the presence of Jesus risen and ruling among us. It's been an enriching delight for me to teach the course, to converse with you throughout the term, and I wish you God's blessing here at the conclusion, and just remind you that we don't have to be in a course together for us to have any conversation about matters related to this class or anything else. You're always invited to reach out with an email, phone call, whatever, so that we can have a conversation if that's something you'd find helpful. So the Lord bless you and enrich your life with the good news that we've learned from the Gospel of Matthew.